Hello, and welcome to the Raisina Ideas Pod, where we at the Raisina Dialogue get together some of the smartest minds that we have attending this conference to discuss the issues that are shaping and defining our future. And on this edition of the Ideas Pod, we're going to be talking about supply chains and the implications of the digitalization and fragmentation, in some cases, of supply chains for geopolitics and for economic resilience. And I have a very high-powered panel with me, who I will introduce as we proceed along this discussion. I'd like to start with you, Jane Holl Lute, who you've had a long career in government, but now you work in related fields. Where do you see the intersection between the role of government and the role of corporations in ensuring that supply chains are resilient and transparent in the future?
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I would say certainly that there are some things that are quite different than even a few years ago, and that there are some things that are stayed the same that bear on this relationship between governments and the private sector when it comes to supply chain. What's different? I think what's different is very clearly now governments have lost the corner on the market of areas that were previously seated as their core competence. They've lost control of the corner on the market on the control of lethality, on the control of capital, and on the control of rulemaking. What do I mean? Governments are still the most significant consolidators of authority regarding lethality, but in many places around the world, private armies can outgun official forces. One need only think of M23 in the Congo, or the Wagner Group, or other related gangs of organized violence outside of government hands. The control of capital. As we know, there are private individuals that control more capital than many governments around the world and play significant roles. In the United States alone, whether it's Warren Buffett, whose opinions shape markets overnight, sometimes instantaneously, or Elon Musk, who is obviously playing a key role in Starlink and in the war in Ukraine, or Bill Gates, who has a tradition of philanthropy that has had a material effect on healthcare globally. And in rulemaking, governments now are not the only voice in the marketplace of making rules. And so these things are really radically different. What's also different is now we live in a world where no one or no thing is self-authenticating. Take my word for it. No one's taking anyone's word for anything. They're looking for a trusted third-party validation, whether it's what governments say or companies say, or what's being said on the internet. And people are learning to be more discerning. We're not fully there yet. It's really very clear also, and this is a difference, that we live in a world where data centricity is a reality. Everything swirls around data, available data, connectivity, the internet. And while data centricity is a reality, data liquidity is an imperative, particularly for managing supply chains. But what has not changed is we talk about supply chains all the time and that they've been globalized. What we talk about far less often is the global supply chain of trouble. Trouble has a supply chain. It has raw materials, it has sources of origination, it has lines of communication, it has retailers, it has wholesalers, it has expediters, and these are all coming together now, and both governments and businesses are having to deal with this.
Thanks, Jane. That was multiple interesting points that I think we'll follow up on, but we'll start with this question about the effect of digitalization and also the need for authenticity and trust, and how important that's become. Bala Subramanian, you're Executive Vice President at UPS. How do you see digitalization, for example, changing the way that we can verify, we can trust where something is coming from?
Got it. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity. Supply chain of trouble. That's pretty interesting. That's a very, very interesting way to look at it. So I think if I think about what pandemic has recently taught us, and in general, if I think about my day job, I think I spend more time watching the Weather Channel because of all the disruptions that happen. And supply chain is actually affected by two areas, right? One is it's man-made, whether it's the war in Ukraine or any other places, and the natural ones, like the one in Turkey, for example. So for us, the name of the game is how can you become resilient? Because we cannot stop what we cannot do it. So our mantra is like control what you can control. So how do you really become resilient in terms of what we can do? And what we actually think about is like, and digital is a very critical aspect of it, because supply chain, while it's inherently physical, it has a very critical aspect to think about, like visibility, which is important. Where is the product at any given time? And then what decisions do you make based on that? A lot of times in environments, right, we talked about multiple governments. Think about brokerage, for example, and think about things which has to happen through multiple customs areas. So what we are trying to do is like, how do you create almost like a digital equivalent, more like a digital twin of the physical environment, and start leveraging that to say the what-if scenarios and run various optionalities in that to see what is the best way to actually deliver the products for the customer. The second thing is also being very clear about transparency. And the transparency is important because if you know what is happening with any disruption, I use the phrase called controlling the blast radius, right? What can you do to reduce the disruption that can actually permeate in what we call a supply chain shocks that kind of cascades across those areas. But if you're able to control the challenges that happen to a smaller area, that would have a significant impact on the resiliency and the ability for us to restore the supply chains. So for that, again, digital is really important because you have to run these hypothetical scenarios, and there is a way we need to do. The complexity is clearly beyond something that you can do in the head of someone who's worked on for 30 to 40 years in this environment. So we have to leverage them, use that knowledge, but really leverage the digital capabilities to it. So those are the two areas I would say. How do you really think about resiliency on supply chain using almost like a digital version of your physical environment? And the second one is, how do you really start to think about what can I do now that I have an issue? How do I control the blast radius? And those are the two areas we actually think about all the time.
Carl Bildt, who was former Prime Minister of Sweden, the question that I'm going to put you sort of emerges from Bala's use of the word resilience. And it's a word that we've been hearing a lot of in the past 3 years, particularly after the pandemic. And because that event stressed the need for resilience, not just in supply chains the supply chain of medicines and vaccines, but across the board for multiple things that are essential for life and the economy. Could you tell us a little bit about what you learned in managing the pandemic?
I can do that. Just make the observation initially that supply chains have always been absolutely critical to human development. We've always been dependent upon them. When we go back to the European Bronze Age, we were dependent upon the tin mines of Cyprus in ages where transportation was really sort of men carrying stones, literally.
And Cornwall, Cyprus and Cornwall, yes.
And Cornwall as well, absolutely, or the pepper trade or whatever. I mean, it's always been like this. But going to the pandemic, I think you're right, that sort of illustrated to us the importance of these particular supply chains. Vaccines, and that was the big issue, as you might remember, is an extremely complicated product, much more complicated than I was aware of because I was recruited by the WHO to help to coordinate these particular, or some of these particular aspects of it. You require roughly 190 different sort of components and things in order to do a vaccine. And these are sourced from literally all over the world. And when you have succeeded with that, then you're also dependent upon being able to sort of export the thing. We had, in the beginning of the pandemic, we were severely hampered by the fact that we had X numbers of trade restrictions. Some of them have been there from the beginning, and some of them were very suddenly imposed by different governments who said we need to control this particular thing, and they thought that they would get in control by controlling one single particular aspect of that particular value chain. It normally backfired because you need all of it. We had, in the beginning of the pandemic, roughly 150 different trade restrictions put up by different governments. I'm not going to name the number one culprits, but there were a couple of them that created a lot of trouble. And intense
Two words beginning with U.
Well, yeah, and one, for a while there was one starting with I as well.
Yes, I know. Admitted.
But we should be diplomatic here today. But gradually, as the pandemic processed and as there become sort of awareness of these particular issues, that was reduced from 150 down to roughly 50. And that was instrumental in making it possible to accelerate the production of vaccines in the way that was really done. But I would say it took roughly a year into the pandemic until this happened, and the full awareness of the importance of the value chains and the importance of really getting rid of the restrictions. Another issue that is, of course, very much in the sort of public spotlight or political spotlight these days is, of course, semiconductors, which is a strategic commodity. But when you look at the value chain there, that's really hyper-globalized. Not only globalized, it's a hyper-globalized value chain, where if you sort of strike down on one particular aspect of it, you create a lot of difficulties somewhere else. And there's an increasing awareness of this. How do we handle it? I think, as was said, I mean, the transparency that we know these things, so that neither government nor private actors do things that create more trouble than they are sort of unforeseen consequences could easily happen. If you do things without being aware of the nature of the supply chains and the value chains, that's the number one thing. Secondly, never succumb to the illusion that you can be entirely independent of them. Because that's never going to happen. I mean, there's sort of the Stone Age, you might have been dependent upon the local stone supply, but since then, I think we have been very much dependent upon these value chains of different sorts. But the transparency, the awareness, the management of them in a responsible way by what we did, I think the pandemic, towards the end of it anyhow, was that we had a public-private global partnership that after some significant initial missteps was quite successful.
Yes, and hopefully might work, for example, for other technologies that are complex but have global relevance in the future, such as maybe climate-related technologies or carbon sequestration technologies and so on and so forth. At least that's what some people have argued. So, okay, we have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to throw a couple of ideas out there and see if anyone bites. One is, since we're talking a little bit about the degree to which, as Carl mentioned, we now may not, and you also mentioned, we not instinctively understand the complexity of either the products that we're using and trading, or of the way that we have to get them to us. These have, in many ways, moved beyond the complexity, as you said, they're capable of being stored in the head of somebody even who's worked in the business for decades. But we're adding an additional geopolitical layer to this complexity frequently now. And the layer of, okay, I would rather not that certain ingredients in a certain thing come from a certain country. I would rather not that certain aspects of this supply chain should be very clearly not exploitative, should be not produced in areas where we know exploitation of a particular kind happens. These are complexities that are being tossed on top of what are already very complex processes, maybe for good reason. But are supply chains, as they stand, ready to handle it? What are the ways in which we can make it easier for companies now to navigate these additional?
So one of the things that struck me as you look at the intersection of business and government in solving problems is that they're both guilty of violating the Christopher Columbus rule. And the Christopher Columbus rule is never fail to distinguish what's new from what's new to you. And so there, for example, I mean, I remember when cyber worms and viruses were being first really dealt with at a large scale, government colleagues were amazed that private sector experts and technologists had a handle on it. The red worm, for example, 20 years ago or so, was actually identified and isolated by a civilian working at a hospital in the middle of the United States. And government colleagues were like, well, we can't talk to you about this because, well, we already know about it. So that was really interesting. On the other side, when private money began to come in significant numbers into the public sector, for example, Gates and all the healthcare initiatives, or Ted Turner and his initiative to the UN, there was a great deal of reluctance to accept this money and just sort of, do whatever you want with it, which is not the case. And the civilian side was, or the business side was, well, look, we're giving you a massive infusion of cash to solve really important problems. What's your problem? And governments were like, these are really carefully, socially adjudicated agendas of priority engagements here, and this money could distort those social agendas. So let's figure out how to do this together. And as Carl said, public-private partnerships are maturing every day, including in managing complex supply chains.
That's wonderful. Bala, do you have any thoughts on how to make this easier for companies and consumers?
Yeah, well, I think Carl already talked about it, right? It's really important that the government and the the private sector is actually connected together. The challenge when we have is when the last minute changes happen. So now you have to kind of reconfigure every aspect of the supply chain. That becomes a challenge for us. The second one is, I think, obviously everybody's got options. So if we look at our customers, they all have various different places they actually go. Transparency is starting to come in. I think technology can solve these problems, but we have to iterate along with along with what the government wants to do and what the businesses eventually want to do too. So an example would be, if you have two places, like one place you don't want to actually start to source with it, having that information a little bit more clear about what problem, what is the issue, so then the rest of the reconfiguration can happen better. And one of the areas that I typically talk about is called orchestration, right? We have visibility. So now we have visibility across the supply chain. And I wouldn't say perfect, right? We always have to continue to improve. But how do you orchestrate it? If you don't want it from place A, which the entire supply chain is configured now, and you want to go to place B, you need to be able to orchestrate and reconfigure the supply chains to do that. And that can be done, but it is a very close collaboration, and not only between government and private, but internationally we have to connect. If you try to ship a product from here to US, and the amount of challenge we go through in trying to get every customs person to touch it and see it, you'll have tears in your eyes, right? So I think how do we really make sure those things are actually much more connected? That's going to be the benefit for us.
Wonderful. I sort of, we do have a minute or so left, so if anybody has any last thoughts, I'd love for them to chime in. But if not, Carl, last thought. The supply chains of energy in the past have defined, and of fossil fuels in particular, have defined the politics of the 20th century. We thought maybe 10 years ago that, you remember the Economist covered data is the new oil, et cetera, et cetera. But in many ways now we recognize that the scarcity is going to be in those minerals and elements that power the sectors of the future, including greener sectors. Are we preparing ourselves in the private sector and in governments across the world for how that shapes geopolitical contestation, the geographies of contestation over the next 30 years?
The brief answer to that is no, because as you alluded to, I mean, the awareness of this is becoming in the last few years. Mm-hmm. That there are suddenly we were dependent on oil and coal and whatever it was in the past, and that was critical commodities, and that sort of guided global geopolitics to a large extent. Now we find there's other minerals, there are other elements that we need to be aware of, and we find that they are located in strange places. So was oil, by the way, to a certain extent. No due respect to the United States. And this awareness is now coming and will reshape global geopolitics to a very large extent. But the key to doing it is, as we've alluded to, is the transparency, the awareness, and the possibility also to track these particular things so that we know what is there, what we need, and what needs to be done, and how we can cooperate to make it possible to access what we need for the global economy.
Thank you. And thank you, Carl, thank you, Jane, thank you, Bala, and I think that was a very enlightening discussion, and thank you for joining us at the Raisina Ideas Pod.